You may think the story of human origins is already written, that we know exactly where we came from and how we became who we are. But what if that story isn't over? What if everything we thought we knew about our beginnings has been told from only one side of the world? For decades, textbooks and documentaries have repeated a single grand narrative. Around 300,000 years ago, modern humans evolved in Africa. Then, about 60,000 years ago, a small band of them left. That cradle spread into Eurasia and eventually replaced every other ancient population they met, including the Neanderthals. According to that model, the Neanderthals were a dead end, a cousin species that vanished after leaving only a faint trace, about 2% of their DNA, lingering in modern non-Africans. It's a clean, satisfying story, but science rarely stays that simple. Recently, new discoveries have begun to whisper another version, one that flips the script completely. What if the genetic and anatomical core of people outside Africa wasn't African at all, but Neanderthal? What if the so-called primitive Europeans and Asians weren't replaced but transformed? In this view, the Great Migration out of Africa wasn't a conquest. It was a meeting, a merger of minds and genes that reshaped both sides forever. This is the Neanderthal problem, a question that challenges one of anthropology's most cherished assumptions. Were we truly the newcomers who took over an empty world, or are we, in a deep and forgotten sense, the Neanderthals themselves, reborn, refined, and still carrying their legacy within our blood? Over the next moments, we'll explore why scientists are daring to rethink the very roots of humanity, and how new fossils and ancient DNA are rewriting the story of us. For more than half a century, scientists have described human evolution as a single river flowing out of Africa, a story with one source and one direction. But the deeper we dig, the more we realize that this river doesn't run straight. It twists, divides, and reunites again and again, like a great braided stream carrying countless branches of humanity toward the present. The idea of a braided stream of evolution has begun to reshape how we see our own origins. It suggests that modern humans didn't emerge from one isolated birthplace, but from a network of connected populations across Africa. Fossil discoveries like those at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 3,150,000 years ago, have changed everything we thought we knew. These early Homo sapiens skulls are unmistakably human, yet their faces are long and archaic, as if caught mid-transition. They show that modern traits were appearing in multiple regions at once, not just in one cradle of mankind. Africa, in this view, wasn't a single birthplace. It was a continent-wide laboratory of evolution. But the story doesn't stop there. In the last decade, archaeologists have uncovered striking evidence that modern humans were venturing beyond Africa far earlier than we used to believe. At Mislia Cave in Israel, a jawbone dated between 177000 and 194000 years old reveals a person who looked and behaved much like us, tens of thousands of years before the so-called Big Migration. In nearby sites such as School and Kafser, human skeletons from around 90000 to 120000 years ago tell the same tale waves of Homo sapiens reaching into the Levant long before the final exodus. These early travelers didn't conquer new lands. They likely mixed with other hominins they met along the way, leaving behind traces that later generations would carry forward. It's as if the human story wasn't a single arrow fired from Africa, but a river delta channels diverging into new landscapes, then flowing back together, each carrying a slightly different sediment of ancestry. And on the far side of that delta, waiting in the cold plains and mountains of Eurasia, were the Neanderthals, a population that had already thrived there for hundreds of thousands of years. They were not strangers. They were cousins, shaped by the same ancestral currents that had given rise to us. Their bodies were built for endurance, and iced their minds for tool-making and social life. For a long time, scientists treated them as outsiders to our story, a side branch that ended in extinction. But when you look through the lens of the braided stream, the picture changes. In this broader view, Neanderthals might not have been a dead end at all. They may have been part of the same intertwined web of populations, part of the same river system that produced modern humans. The boundaries between us and them start to blur. The people of Jebel Irhoud, the wanderers of Mislia, and the Neanderthals of Europe and Asia could all have been part of a continuous flowing experiment, humanity in motion shaping itself through time and contact. When we see our evolution as a braided stream instead of a single channel, it explains why fossils and DNA refuse to fit into neat categories. It helps us understand why modern humans and Neanderthals share so many physical and genetic similarities, and why every new discovery seems to complicate rather than simplify the story. Perhaps the truth is that the river of human origins didn't just flow out of Africa, it circled back again and again, mixing and transforming until the very definition of modern human became impossible to draw cleanly. And somewhere along those returning tides, the Neanderthals became more than distant relatives. They became one of the main channels of that river, the core from which the modern peoples of Eurasia would one day arise. For generations, we've pictured the meeting between Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals as a brief and tragic encounter, a collision between the future and the past. In that familiar story, a small, clever band of humans swept out of Africa, crossed into Eurasia, and replaced their archaic cousins almost overnight. The Neanderthals, strong but slow, vanished into extinction, leaving only a faint 2% echo of their genes in us. But what if that story is upside down? Imagine instead that Eurasia was never an empty stage waiting for newcomers, but a vast, thriving world already inhabited by Neanderthals populations that had lived, adapted, and evolved there for hundreds of thousands of years. In this alternative model, often called the Neanderthal core hypothesis, the people we now call non-Africans didn't simply absorb a small dose of Neanderthal DNA. They were largely Neanderthal themselves, an ancient Eurasian lineage later upgraded by waves of incoming Homo sapiens genes that carried new traits, sharper cognition, more delicate faces, perhaps even subtler forms of communication. In the traditional model, a small stream of modern humans flows out of Africa and replaces the archaic populations of Europe and Asia. In the new model, the current reverses. Homo sapiens were not a flood that erased what came before, but droplets falling into an already immense sea, a sea of Neanderthal humanity that stretched from Spain to Siberia. The out of Africa event still happened, but it was more like a genetic and cultural infusion than a total takeover. This reinterpretation explains several puzzles that the old story never quite solved. It explains why modern Europeans and Asians all share the same Neanderthal genetic segments, because they inherited them not from a brief encounter, but from a deep ancestral base that was already Neanderthal. It also explains why the genetic distance between Neanderthals and modern humans is so small. They were never separated by an unbridgeable gulf. They were sister branches interlacing again and again through time. The line between them was porous, more like a gradient than a wall. When we look at the fossils, the picture begins to make even more sense. In places like Bacho Kiro in Bulgaria, skeletons show a blend of traits anatomically modern humans whose ancestors were likely Neanderthal just a few generations back. In Zlati Kun in the heart of Europe, DNA from an early modern human shows long stretches of Neanderthal ancestry, proof of close and recent mixing. And across the Levant in caves like School and Quafse, we find individuals who look neither fully Neanderthal nor fully Homo sapiens transitional beings who may have carried both legacies within them. These were not failed experiments or evolutionary dead ends. They may have been our own grandparents. If the Neanderthal core hypothesis is true, then the people of Eurasia didn't inherit a small Neanderthal signature. They are that signature, transformed by time and selective advantage. The Neanderthals didn't vanish. They changed shape. Their broad faces and powerful bodies were gradually refined as new genes arrived, bringing lighter skeletons, rounder skulls, and perhaps subtle shifts in brain wiring that favored language and creativity. Over generations, natural selection sculpted this hybrid population into the beings we recognize as modern humans. But beneath the surface, the foundation remained Neanderthal. Think of it this way: the Neanderthals weren't erased, they were edited. A few key genetic lines from Africa acted like new software installed on old hardware updates that enhanced cognition, flexibility, and imagination while keeping the body adapted to harsh Eurasian climates. The result was a fusion, not a replacement, a continuity that bridged deep time and geography. And when we see the Upper Paleolithic explosion, the rise of art, symbolic thought, and long-distance trade, perhaps we're witnessing not the triumph of a new species, but the awakening of an ancient one perfected by union. The Neanderthals didn't disappear into our past. They became our past, and through us, they still live. When you look in the mirror, you might see a face that feels entirely modern: the smooth skin, the rounded skull, the upright posture. But hidden inside every cell of your body lies an ancient signature, a quiet echo of another kind of human who once walked the earth. The Neanderthals are gone, yet they never truly disappeared. Their legacy is written into our DNA, shaping how we look, how we think, and even how we survive today. Geneticists have discovered that many of the traits that helped humans adapt to life outside of Africa came directly from our Neanderthal inheritance. Some of these genes are life-saving. Variants in genes like TLR-IRAK4 and MYD88 passed down from Neanderthals strengthen the immune system's early response to bacteria and viruses. These genetic upgrades likely gave our ancestors a survival advantage when they first entered Eurasia, a land filled with new diseases and unfamiliar climates. Without them, the first modern humans might not have lasted long in those cold and pathogen-rich environments. Other inherited genes shape the way we look. Neanderthal variants affect skin color and hair texture, fine-tuning the body to handle weak sunlight and frigid temperatures. Lighter skin allowed better vitamin D synthesis in northern latitudes, while thicker hair helped conserve warmth. These traits didn't just happen by chance, they were sculpted by selection drawn from Neanderthal genes that had already mastered the art of surviving the Ice Age. And the influence doesn't stop at the surface. Inside our brains and bodies, Neanderthal DNA still whispers. Some genetic segments are linked to sleep cycles, mood regulation, and even how we process pain. Studies suggest that Neanderthal variants can affect our risk for depression, nicotine use, and immune overreaction, a reminder that evolution's gifts often come with trade-offs. Perhaps the most vivid example came during the COVID-19 pandemic. One particular stretch of DNA on chromosome 3, inherited from Neanderthals, was found to increase the risk of severe respiratory illness. Yet another Neanderthal-derived region on chromosome 12 seemed to do the opposite, providing protection against the virus. The message is clear: the Neanderthal legacy inside us is not purely good or bad. It is complex, a mirror of life itself, a blend of strengths and vulnerabilities that has shaped who we are. And while much of this heritage lives on in people outside of Africa, that doesn't make Africa any less central to our story. African populations remain genetically richer and more diverse, the deep reservoir from which all human lineages ultimately flow. The reason Africans today have little visible Neanderthal DNA is simple geography. They lived far from the regions where humans and Neanderthals interbred. Later, small-back migrations from Eurasia carried traces of Neanderthal ancestry into Africa, but the overall amount stayed modest. Still, Africa was and remains the heartbeat of human evolution, the place where new ideas, genes and technologies arose again and again, spreading outward to refresh the rest of the world. When you think about it, modern humanity is not the product of a single root, but of two ancient worlds, entwined: the African world that birthed us, and the Eurasian world that refined us through the Neanderthal inheritance. Every breath you take, every immune response your body mounts, every flicker of emotion in your mind carries a spark from both. We are not simply Homo sapiens standing apart from our extinct cousins. We are their continuation, a hybrid species built from their endurance and our curiosity. The Neanderthals live on not as fossils in museums, but as quiet companions inside our cells, guiding us still through the challenges of the modern world. For centuries, we've told the story of human origins as if it were a conquest, one species rising while another fades into dust. But the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes there was no conquest. There was no clean victory or total replacement. What happened was far more profound, a blending, a long conversation written in genes, tools, and memories shared beneath ancient skies. The Neanderthals were never simply erased. They were absorbed, transformed, and carried forward through us. Every time we breathe, laugh, create, or love, fragments of their legacy stir within ourselves. We are not their replacements. We are their continuation. The story of humanity is not one of dominance, but of connection, of learning, adapting, and becoming something greater together. More than 100 years ago, the anatomist Arthur Keith wrote, "Of all the problems concerning extinct forms of man, none is more fascinating than that which concerns the Neanderthal. Where did he come from? And where did he finally go?" A century later, we are beginning to answer him. The Neanderthal never truly went anywhere. He became us. As technology unlocks more ancient DNA, we are discovering that the borders between species, like those between cultures, are illusions drawn in sand. The more we uncover, the more we realize that humanity has always been a tapestry, threads woven from countless hands, countless ancestors, countless worlds. So perhaps it's time to change the way we see ourselves. We are not the conquerors of the past, but the children of survival, the heirs of two ancient worlds reborn through their union. If you've ever believed that the story of humankind belonged only to Homo sapiens, think again. The blood that runs through you tells a richer, deeper story, one that began long before us and one that still lives within.